Welcome everybody. My name is Mark Keane. I'm a professor of architecture. These are the draw along sessions with Keane on architecture. For this session we're going to look at probably one of the most visited buildings on the face of the earth. It's Notre Dame de Paris in Paris, France. There's about 13 million people that visit it annually, which means 35,000 people roughly a day go inside this building to see what it's all about. And which means also in the country of France, that 35,000 is larger than 99% of its other cities and towns in the country. So it's a very singular city-centric community. In the middle of that community in Paris is the most significant medieval structure at the time. And we'll talk about why. What's driven this to go from sort of fame to fortune to demise and back to fame and fortune. And then tragedy just a couple of years ago, which is being reborn now in the future months. So when we look at Notre Dame, before we get to the actual sketch and start to do the draw along, you'll see it's not an invention of its own. I've got three models they're not to scale of each other, it's just how they randomly print, but they get larger in time. This is Notre Dame of Paris, this is Chartres Cathedral, and this is Reims Cathedral. So sequentially it's 1163, 1194, and 1211 in terms of the reference of when these were built. And so each one is like a competitive conglomerate business-like invention by the bishops to build taller with the same technology. It's a growth in scale and size. Notre Dame has really got its situation because it's in the middle of Paris, which was a spectacularly growing town in the Middle Ages. So it's got a prominence that way. It also is the first with the flying buttresses, which are iconic in all these cathedrals for support to create a celestial home for Mary on earth. The first time they were done integrally with the cathedral was at Notre Dame. So we'll walk back some of the ideas before Notre Dame to see where it came from. We'll talk about some of the ideas of the growth from that moving forward, but we'll spend the bulk of the next hour together drawing the cathedral itself. What you'll see in plan type here is the concept of how the professional faith grew from the days of Christ on earth and the serving of the Mass to the architecture that supported it through the Middle Ages up until the Gothic era, which is a high point literally and figuratively in terms of the language of the Christian Mass at the time. So if we do a cardinal axis move as if this is north, east, south, and west, the diagram explains how the faith is working. So basically the sun rises in the east every day and goes over the cathedral and sets in the west. So Christ as light is the dawn of light pervading the people who would go to morning mass before they worked in the fields. It sets in the afternoon in the city side plazas, so the public front of this is on the city side of all the cathedrals on that due east-west axis. And then some will have relationships to the town off the south or north pole, depending on their site and the type of community they were built in. These two towers here are urban and are meant to be fulfilling the promise of being the spiritual center, so you can see them from a distance. The crossing of the cruciform-shaped plan is part of the idea of the epic pinnacle or spire that shows that's the most sacred part of the church that happens underneath it. And then the size and scape of what the cruciform place is like or how wide or long it is really based on the benefactor of the bishop and how they see the vision of the tourists or the pilgrims that would come to the site, and the demands would scale the churches differently. Going back to the cruciform plan though, the idea here is this is literally Christ on the cross. And so the feet of Christ on the cross are the people, the legwork that did the services for them and bring the bounty for the church, the cathedrals to exist. And they move towards the celebration of the sacraments in the Christian faith. Where they cross is Christ on the cross proper, as if there's actually a diagram of it, and that's the heart of the church then on the cross, Christ's heart, and that's where the sacred part of the sacraments are feasted over the high altar there. And then the back third of the church is typically relegated toward the clergy, and it's more of a private part of the church, and yet some have got so many different types of relics from the Christian era that could be a mass going on in the center spine of the nave, and yet a secondary ambulatory to see all the side chapels of all the different relics from the biblical past. In the front of all the cathedrals then there typically is a reading of the Bible out of sculpture and stained glass, which shows sort of an articulation of diagrams graphically for people, because back in the Middle Ages most people couldn't read. so they could hear oral stories, they could see images, but they couldn't read the Bible. So the Bible takes place in figuratively on the frontispiece of the church than interior sculptures. So we'll talk more about the formwork here when we get to parts of the sketch. What I want to do next is just sort of show that diagram up here on the right of the language of a typical ecclesiastical work back in the Middle Ages. So again, east to west, there is a block which has to serve for the people in a procession from the front portal, moving from west to east. So they're going towards the rising sun. Then there's the cross with the wings of the transept to the sacred part for the clergy in the back. And most are rounded off in the form of an ambulatory, the idea to walk around that, the Spirit of Christ there. So the light of Christ is part prosaic and also part of literal in terms of starting the day. They'd come back after the day in the field and come back to an evening mass to close the day. So the church can grow either way. Some have 5 aisles, some have 4, some have 3, different scale churches. More masculine, more of the Romanesque and sort of castle-like of the fortified western end, because the church is a sanctuary as well for people of the faith. And so that kind of diagram there explains that it's like an amoebic or a growing organism site by site. So they're all related from the early Christian churches through the Romanesque to the Gothic, to the late Gothic. Even in the 19th century, they're still building late Gothic buildings, and they all surmise from the same type of qualities of early work. So like in any sketch here, we want to find the boxes that we talk about in any type of these draw-along sessions and how to pin them down to what we know about the ideas of mechanics of perspective. So because this is such a tall vertical structure, and whenever you walk up to it, your eyes soar up to the top, it puts the horizon line for an individual person very low at the base, which means to get as much as we can on the paper, we're going to put the horizon line well down at the bottom, about an inch off the bottom of the paper. And then we know there are 2 vanishing points. In this case, I picked a view of this so that we'd see the most of the church can offer from one view shed. And for me, that's when you visit Paris and you're on the same grade level. You're not at river level, you're up above on the city, which is about almost 2 stories now. It's been built up over time, that takes you up to the level of the base of Notre Dame. And when you get to the bridge that's closest to us over here, then you take a left and you see the whole south elevation with the transept, with the frontal pieces, with the spire, and some of the flying buttresses. So it's a great representation of all the Gothic kind of cues towards the language. So that's our eye height. So here's a person then crossing the bridge with their head, their torso, and then walking up to the cathedral. And so somebody closer to it right in front, the same person but drawn smaller in scale, shows the distance between those two. So it's to this day an incredibly impressive structure, no matter how many photographs you've seen in advance, to understand the scale of this once you get on the site. Then you walk in the doors and it's even more impressive in terms of the verticality, because its relationship between its width and its height is proportionally one of the most vertical out of all Gothic churches, which seems like it soars more. Chartres is taller, Reims is taller, Amiens is taller, Beauvais is the tallest, but they're also wider. So Notre Dame's got this presence of being really vertical in terms of soaring. It's really domineering when you walk inside the space. So now we have our vanishing points articulated here. We go to the top of the box and find the notion of coming down to the left point here. And then the top of the box over here, which is sort of giving you as key points to start the sketch, will drive off to a point which will be off the paper. So once again, if you feel like slide another piece over there so you can find that point for all your lines, that's fine. But just realize it's mostly orthographic model making here. So everything that's parallel and horizontal has to go to this point or the point off the paper over there. So the front is a great little aspect between the 12th and the 14th century, again, because it wasn't a very literate community. They told the story in that front aspect. So this is basically a book, considered a Bible in stone, where many of the stories are shown between the portals down here, the King's Gallery. All the definition of stained glass is a feature you read, in fact, by the graphics out front. So we want to bring those 2 towers down. Right here in the middle, they split. There's the south tower, and there's the corner of the north tower. And so the top of the north actually comes back to our right vanishing point. So we're going to have a block, a void, and another block. So we want to draw the south tower, a void, and then the north tower. And one difference we're going to see in this perspective, because I chose a view that gets us fairly close to the actual object itself, if we're further away, the verticals remain purely vertical. The closer you come to a box, it accentuates the verticals, and you can see here they actually vanish to a third vanishing point, not on the horizon line, but way up here, so that we want to cant those out a little bit, because the closer you get to a tower, the more the verticals actually collapse to a point well up in the sky. So it's not on the horizon line, but that's why all perspectives are actually 3-point perspectives, but mostly they're 2-point dominant. So in this case, we're so close to Notre Dame, we're actually going to use a point way off of here. That's why the tick marks and the lines I've drawn for you so far actually cant the edges. So the transept over here are 2 parallel lines, but they're actually going to go up in space towards that. The base of the spire are 2 parallel lines, but they're actually going to converge towards a point there. So the Bible in stone shows about the Christian teachings. There are dioramas on the front. So there's no reading available, so it's full of statues and reliefs. And the types of aspects you'd find, there's 3 major portals here, doorways into the cathedral, and they're for different aspects of how you use the cathedral. So one's got, depicts St. Stephen on the far left. The middle one has got the synagogue or the Church of Christ in the center. And on the right are the false and true revelations that are shown within the portals that enter into the church here. And one's only open to tourists all the time, one's open for annual events, and one rarely is ever open. You have to have a coronation to open up the main one in the center there. So those we're going to draw sort of in a diagram here to show the depth of those. So you've got a little bit of a sense of this arch, but it's an oblique view. We're going to curl that down and then have, because it's all articulated in stone, instead of on a straight line, we're kind of drawing wiggled stone versions of sculpture that might follow it down to the grade in those openings. And they'll curl back. And we'll find with value, they'll be very deep inside that elevation. Those portals push back into that skin of the building. And then right above that is the King's Gallery, which unfortunately in the Revolution, when obviously in 1789, when they were revolting against King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette and trying to overturn the Bourbon family, they also at the same time had to overturn Catholicism. So this became a temple of reason instead of a cathedral to the Christian faith. They had thought that the kings up here that are celebrated in sculpture above here were the kings of France. That's how sort of illiterate the people were when they were in their kind of hastened state. In fact, they were the kings of Judea from the Bible. So they were beheaded and cast astray, but in the restoration process, they're back now intact. So up here, we've got an array again of obliquely looking at sculpture of figurines up here on that area that go across the skin. And then just above that, there's a very sort of prophetic piece of stained glass enhanced in a circular element. So beneath the split between the towers, then there's the Grand Gallery up above, which is a walkway that tourists move to between the 2 bell towers. In this middle center section here, there is a square which vanishes down, and inside that square there's a pure circle. So like in any perspective, you can find the circle by bisecting it and finding those 4 points. So if this is the square, we bisect it, and in perspective find those points, we know the circle will connect at those, almost those points of like a Greek cross. When we do that, we're putting in a circle in perspective, kind of obliquely. Right in the middle of that circle up in front is a statue of Mary, because this is Mary's celestial kingdom. Notre Dame de Paris. Notre Dame, all over the world, there's different Notre Dames, and that's signs of the home of Mary on earth. And so the idea was to praise that with this vertical soaring toward the heavens. So the sculpture's out here in front of the stained glass. The stained glass is a lovely array of vetted windows in a 12 field that march around. The light comes through in the church from the western sunlight. And the reason why it's set up this way is it's part of the theater of the spectacle of seeing sculpture and glass interconnect. So out front, if we come from the right vanishing point in front of the cathedral, project over from both, there is a large open plaza. The French call it a place or a parvis. And if you step back, there's a point right in front of the middle portal, right in front of the statue of Mary, that's got a little placard. It's a little piece of a gold placard that's in the stone here. That piece of stone is where all measurements to other cities from Paris and the country of France are measured. So when you're down in the south of France and it says 685 kilometers to Paris, they mean that spot in Paris. So that means when you finally get to Paris and you visit the Cathedral of Notre Dame, you need to stand there, look back up at Mary, and when you stand on that one point and that one point and only, you look up here, the stained glass is her halo. As you move around, it goes away from being her halo. There's only one spot on the ground where it matches right behind her head, and this massive piece of stained glass is behind the medieval sculpture of Mary there. And so that's the setup where they use the church as like theatrical ideas to explain the Christian faith to the people that couldn't read the Bible at the time. So that's one of the more spectacular views for that. So when we're doing this sort of architecturally, it's a very demanding type of performance to raise stone off the face of the earth. Because a stone rests down here, you could pick up in your hand. A stone up here, when it's that far away from the earth, times its distance, has got so much more physical force that if you look at the front facade, it actually has a little bit of a triangulated pyramidal view to it where it kicks out as it gets wider at the base. And that's what helps drive the triangulated version of these cathedrals to have support on an angle coming down rather than straight up and down. So as we come down here on the edges, we're going to bump out a little bit at a time on this face to show a broader edge to the base of this tower in sections marching down. And that little bit of triangulation creates feet for that structure, because if you're absolutely true and plumb, your tendency is to have failure one way or another. If you set it in and cock it in a little bit, you've got more residual types of performance. So you mirror that over on the other side as that comes down and bounce out those edges that get broader toward the base. And we'll articulate with that value later, but you can see a little bit of that triangulation now. It's like a very tall, slender pyramid, and now we're going to make it more articulate as we draw the nave and then the transept here. So coming back over here is the body of the church, and the interior doesn't rise all the way to the top of the roof. This is simply the roof which covers the stone on the inside. So that's a forest of oak trees, which you know is of 2019 burned down because they had some construction issues with torches and things got out of hand, and the church, in the course of a matter of hours, all the roof structure collapsed and destroyed the interior, and they've been busy restoring it since then. So, but the transept takes you back, it crosses, and now we revert back to the left vanishing point, and it comes up to the peak of its pitched roof too, and then down. As it steps down on both sides of the transept, it too is going to burnish out sequentially at the edge. So those are the main pieces. From this view, there's the whole apse back here, but we're looking at it from this point. So by the time we see enough of that, we're losing some of the aspect of these behind the trees that are in the foreground there. So once we put the southern garden here, the edge of the trees, which are going to sort of create this private zone adjacent to this, away from the busy city across the river, we're only going to see a little bit of the apse come back, and then by the time it comes here, it tails down to its end. So we see a lot of foreshortening of this in the distance. So that's all we see at that point behind the trees there. So now the key to support this, as you raise that block of stone further and further up, is again this pyramidal effect that we're taking the shaft of the cathedral, the interior choir, and maybe that's a person inside of that, and it's just rising up as much as possible, so you're trying to create the idea of heavens on earth. So what it wants to happen is it wants to fail this way or this way, by the pressure of the loads of snows or waters or just the weight of material, it wants to fail and crumble. So the idea of flying buttresses are to take dead loads of weight and mimic the idea of a pyramidal design. So obviously the most significant pyramidal design on Earth are the pyramids in Egypt that have stayed intact for thousands and thousands of years based on the idea of the most structurally sound platonic shape is the triangle, because you can't shorten the other without failing the other two, so it's just rigid. As opposed to a square, it can keep all four sides the exact same size and fail. That can happen to a triangle. So to approximate this, you don't want to put a wall of stone next to this because you lose your light. You put dead weights of walls of stone here, and you simply spring this load that's coming down here and support it with those verticals. So it's like taking a structural diagram from 1163, before calculus, before the internet, before mathematics of any sort that does structural analysis, and find that type of line of precision that says we can counterbalance the throw of the stone along lines rather than just mass itself. How do you do the pyramids with very little material? It's by using the structure of that triangle coming down. So what we have here is stepping down, and we can double up these lines to start because there's thickness to the walls there. And they have pieces that work out towards a triangle, but they're lightweight relatively compared to the rest of the church, and they step away from the glass. So there's a light diaphanous type of movement of these integral panels of stone, which are actually taking the throw of all the weight coming this way and resisting it that way. So it's a counterforce, and it wraps all the way around the cathedral. And with that, all the light still pervades, because in between every element of structure, that's where the stained glass is for the two tiers of interior elevation. So before we go more on this, we've got one more piece up front, which is not original. It's done by the architect that redesigned this place and brought it back and reconstituted it in the 19th century. His name is Eugene Emmanuel Viollet-le-Duc. He's going to be brought back onto the sculpture up here because his sculpture of him holding the T-square up there also was melted and fell to ruin, and so they're going to rebuild that, and he'll get his initial place of fame up there. But he also built for them a 19th century sort of administration there for the clergy. So there are some outbuildings here in the foreground, which aren't our subject, but we're just going to sort of hint at them kind of being there as a placeholder for us next to the building. Because it'd be dismissed if we didn't articulate that they are there, but we don't then become a subject for us. So we'll just kind of hint at those more of as a cartoon gesture. Now the buttresses turn and they come over this way towards supporting the transept 2, because it's got the same system coming down to the ground. And then on the other side, that drops down, and we see a couple more that comes towards the edge of the cathedral over here on the backside facing east. So those are our systems in terms of the three main pieces. The narthex, the neck of it, the entry into the neck before you come into the actual faith-based processional clergy there. And then the crossing tower is the spire called the flesh, which is, I believe it was not essential to the medieval scheme, but done in the 19th century by, again, Viollet-le-Duc's version of Notre Dame. And so out of iron now, he had built this lightweight structure, again, got lost in the fire a couple years back. And so that'll be the crossing tower. So now you know you're in the center at the heart of Christ. And then on both sides here, we've got some stone spires which kind of crown the magnificent stained glass of the south transept. Okay, so our next piece is to take all this stone, which is bared since 1163, almost 900 years now coming on. Its weight on the earth, we have to have a nice strong base down here that receives it. So we're going to continue with the vegetation over here of the park on the south side, and it's going to come right up towards the western entry here at the end of its park. And then at this point, it comes to the small bridge that connects the bank with the left bank with the island that it sits on, Isla Cité. And so that's the walkway and the rail detail. It comes to a point. So at this point over, you're on a bridge. At this point, you're looking down onto the river. It's one of the smallest bridges in Paris because it's such a tight configuration. And it's also a very odd condition now because we don't understand its original promise of being a step up to a sacred ground, because the city of Paris used to be on Riverside. And again, it's about a 2-story building beneath this plinth here now, where the city has simply built up over 850 years. And so it's a flat plain, even to a point where the plane is actually tilted. This parvis is actually taller here, so you actually walk down a bit and then take as little as 1 step to get to the plateau of Notre Dame, where it's meant to be a really large walk upstairs to get to that hallowed site. So the conditions much better felt at the cathedral at Chartres, where on the transept side, for instance, here, it's a whole series of stairs that takes you up to the door on both the south and the north side. But that base will give us a foundation for how to value that, to hold all the stone. We'll take the little bit of neighboring architecture, which is the rest of the Second Empire work from the 19th century, that will follow the line of Notre Dame and stop at like 7 stories. So that's a 7-story building to give you a size of just how tall Notre Dame is. And that goes down a couple blocks. And then we'll see a little bit of architecture coming back this way to this corner, and that'll stop. So this is the street then that crosses completely across Ile-la-Cité from the left bank to the right bank, as making Notre Dame kind of a center spine of the north-south axis in the city. So we'll do that with value in a little bit too. Now for the backdrop over here, these trees become larger towards the south end, and they'll rest back down on the fencing there. So our first thing now, since we've got it all boxed out, we've got our language, we're going to go to our light, shade, and shadow, and simply start with the sun angle. So this is the south side, so we could pick any time of the day. I think just to make this really dominant, we won't make it a southwestern sun, because then both are lit. We're going to make it more of a morning southern sun. So the south side is well projected, and then the west is in shade. So if we do that, that means this whole tower side, with the space in between, because that'll receive light, is valued out. And you can leave some little bits of white in there. Don't make it just completely colored in. But that'll give us started there to give more dimension to those towers going up. And we'll do the same for this part of the transept, which doesn't receive light at this time of day. And that'll drop down, and then this part of the roof that turns towards the south doesn't receive light. And then everything else will. This part of this little administration building. And then obviously all the growing aspects down here, which are kind of just diagrammatic for now, we'll just wash with a simple tone as a placeholder, because that obviously stops our view of the cathedral. We'll take that right down to the stone of the walkway. And then the apartments and the commercial that runs down this part of the street on Ile-la-Cité doesn't receive any light. Notre Dame casts a shadow on that too, so that whole element gets washed out too with the dark. This receives light, and these don't, and they might have some trees on the parvis at that end of it. Now the cathedral then, with the lights coming from this side, will cast a shadow coming across the parvis from this corner all the way back, and then it'll be a fairly dark shadow that time of day. So that come all the way down to the base and settle in right at the base of that. So now we have a good foot there, and then the garden will have its cast shadow back in this area from all the trees in the front. And the stone is brilliant white when cleaned up. They're quickly shifting over to electric buses. The roads in downtown Paris are less vehicular now. They're more for bikes and for pedestrian travel. So if this is bright stone, then the new decking up top here will be a deeper tone. It's the metal roofing that comes down on an angle and turns and goes over this way. So that'll be washed with its lead-colored coating for it. And this is a darker metal, so this whole thing, even though it's diaphanous and it's got openings and see-through aspects, the top is opaque, but sides of that will rise up. And now the windows, and that's the glory of the space because its stained glass isn't as powerful as Notre Dame and Chartres, but it's got a great value to it for being this medieval epic from so many years ago. We have to think of architecture then, when you come to glass not being light and airy and transparent, but being opaque and dark. So when you see glass, you feel like you're going inside the space. So at the top here, it's not actually glazing to it, it's an open air space and it takes it to the bell chamber. So from the Disney classic or from the early black and white movies on Notre Dame, these are the bell towers of Quasimodo. So there's two openings here, and we'll see the same openings here, but we only see them in a forced perspective, so they're more like just dark lines on the two north and south towers. And then just beneath them are paired openings of arched entryways, and then it becomes much more a mural because the idea was in Gothic construction is you make it massive here with very little windows, and as you move up, you add more and more glass, which lightens the structure as well. So not only is it becoming more powerful by being triangulated, there's less material to support, which helps reduce the load. So coming down here where these piers are, we did the line for the pier stepping out this way. As the piers come down, they're also stepping out in both directions. So the piers are wider at the base. So it does that at that end, and over here, and then a third one in the middle, just for that extra support to counterbalance the force of these towers. And then there are breaks along the way, sort of capital heights to them. Classical language isn't ever totally dead. And so that gives enough form for the towers for now. We'll detail that in a little bit. Now we're going to move into the real glory windows, which are the ones in between these elements here. So what happens when these become stone bastions running down, they'll eclipse whatever glazing we can see, but we still, from this vantage point, see ribbons of second floor and first floor areas of dark glazing between those. And so that will show, in terms of the outside, the sense that it's got these windows which are celebrated much more on the inside because they don't illuminate with color in the exterior unless it's night and they project light on the inside. It's more sensational when the sun comes through, and that's the great sort of projector operator as it moves across the southern sky. So here's our roof line coming down again over here. Okay, then the rose windows here. There's a secondary rose window on the north as well as on the south. Excuse me, on the south transept as well as on the north. So we can put inside that circle diagram I had. You can inscribe it in a square and know that it's tangential on 4 points there. So it's big and broad, and when the light pours in from the south, it's really a great spectacle. And then it's got its rows of wheels that run there in sort of medieval fashion. So we can't make that a subject, but we can have a little diagram of kind of expressing that a little bit. And now it's time to look at the sort of the period and piece of the spectacle of this place, the light, shade, and shadow, just the concert of things that happened over the years. Joan Arc was beatified here. The Parisians came to Notre Dame and prayed to survive the Black Death from the 1340s. The French came back and prayed for the latter part of the 1300s for success in the Crusades. It's a symbol of like a real heroic path, but it's also a symbol for the revolution because it symbolized everything wrong with society at one point. So it became the Age of Reason, and yet Napoleon came back when he became emperor and decided to have a Christian mass there and coordinated himself. He grabbed the crown out of the bishop's hand and put it on himself. And from that day on, he said this will become a cathedral again. So Napoleon was the one that kind of brought it back online. And on top of that, when I mentioned Quasimodo before, it was the author of that book, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, Victor Hugo, who really decided that it's the 1840s and this building is the most heroic piece of Paris, but we're denying its actual place and time, so we have to restore it. So he wrote at one point, I'll quote you this because it's really pretty powerful, about how he felt about this and how a piece of literature could bring back Notre Dame so that we have it as we see it today. Hugo wrote, "But noble as it has remained while growing old, one cannot but regret, cannot but feel indignant at the innumerable degradations and mutilations inflicted on the venerable pile, both by the action of time and the hand of man, regardless alike of Charlemagne, who laid the first stone, and Philip Augustus, who laid the last. On the face of this ancient queen of our cathedrals, beside each wrinkle, one invariably finds a scar. Time is blind, but man is senseless." So with that Quasimodo and the Hunchback of Notre Dame, there was this grandeur celebrated by how he sent people back in the time and how heroic this was. And that started the whole process of Italy the Duke's restoration of it. And so it came back into being its sort of place in the prestige of French architectural history. Now, to help our stone become even more animated and dominant in this, we're going to go to the sky, because if you look in the photograph, the stone is very, very white, and the sky, even though you seem like, well, the sky should be light too, when you photograph a blue sky, it's actually a fairly deep tone. So we're going to accentuate that. We're going to cover up our sketch over here and bring in a darker sky next to the top of the building and kind of fade it out over here, and that should make this tower appear more brilliant and more three-dimensional. And the way you want to start that, if you can see what happens with the sky, it gradates from being darker at the top and then drops to becoming whiter and whiter at the base, because all of the particles in the atmosphere kind of take color away. So we just simply have to start at the top here and go on the side of one of your more duller colored pencils there and just bring it at a 45-degree angle, kind of a wash of tone, and bring that right up to the tower top. And keep doing that, and when it comes down to the base here, we're going to use less and less measure or pressure on that, so it just becomes page white down at the base there. And without doing that, the sky will appear like a wall if it isn't gradated top to bottom, where the sky really needs to be perceived as a plane in space going over your subject. The only way to do that is to value the sky from a deeper tone up top. So now once you have that done, do the exact same thing again, but press a little bit harder at the top, and then less and less, and then stop halfway and go back and do it again until you've got established a nice dark gray up in this left corner. And now to shape it, we're going to move that around and be less definitive as we move to the right of the building here, but that has to go around the white and come all the way down to this edge. And that'll celebrate that south tower. But to make this sort of move from left to lower right, the human eye is attracted to value change. And so if it's darker here, then lighter, then lighter, then darker, it'll move the people diagonally across the image. So we'll bring that by the spire. And then fade it away by the plan a little bit, but then keep taking it down a bit toward the grade, and we can go to white at the edge over here. So now that pulls that white off. I think you can see now that this white of the south tower being washed by the sun seems like a brighter white than the page we started with. And that's the importance of making sure beyond your horizon line and your two vanishing points, you always include value. So now we've got the basis of the sketch kind of where we're heading. We have to detail it more to show the actual frailty of some of the parts here. And we have to go through our value setup. And so our value setup is, working from some type of bar. We have page white. It becomes darker and darker and darker until it's actually the blackest the pencil can get. And so we've got zones of it now. We want to accentuate what we've done. So we'll come back to the trees, knowing that the trees right now seem like a flat cardboard plane of just tree line. They project the shadow onto themselves. So the bottom third of all the trees is going to be darker than the top third. And then some will cast shadows on other trees adjacent to it. So we can kind of model those a little bit and have them run right to the base of the stone fencing at the bridge level. And that'll help, again, contrast with the white stone. And then we'll come over to the edge of all the architecture. And the key then is, if you find a line that's actually holding space behind it or volume behind it, that's a more important piece of value than something that's just sort of decorative in the front. So this piece is just the detail of the stone there, so that's fine by itself. This is a piece of detail of the stone, but the sky goes beyond that, behind that, so that we can make that stronger and darker as it comes down on this edge, and it frees it up from what's immediately behind it. So that edge can come all the way up here and wrap around and then separate from the north tower by making that a stronger line. Same is true now for the north tower. And when we're coming around the edge, looking at the photograph here, or if you can check out your sketch with some online images later on, you'll see there's a real nice definition per zone here, where they add some detail when they make a change in the dimension and detail of things. So we can come up to the gallery there, and much like the one with the kings here, which we might put a little value of lights and darks around just the shape of their forms and value and light. The same is true for the gallery up top here, the Grand Gallery, which is simply just a stone arcade of vertical Gothic elements which kind of protect the movement of people from side by side. So I believe when you visit here, you'll be ticketed out in the visitor center over here in the bottom left. You'll go up the North Tower, cross over the King's Gallery to go see Emmanuel's Bell up here, then eventually come to the top for your view of Paris. Okay, then to pull that element off, because this plane of the tower is closer to us than the plane of these towers come out, so this plane's closer than the plane of the actual nave, we can come to the adjacent stone to it and wash that a little bit grayer, and that'll set the two planes apart. And there are little vignettes of openings to let the roof breathe up here. Some are actually full-blown windows. There's the decorative trim of all the ironwork here. It's got its beadwork. And now to show this being diaphanous, we see the metal on the outside, which is dark, and then we see through it to the sky, but then we also see the underside because we're beneath it, wrapping around, so we can actually see very dark areas on the underside of the spire rising up. And that makes it seem more diaphanous, as if it's not just a stone structure, but it's kind of an animated dark metal structure. Okay, we'll come to the edge here because the brightest part of the stone now is not in the middle of it, but the brightest part is right where it touches the gray over here. So if we come to the west side of the tower and make that gray a little bit more dominant right where it meets our side tower, and I'll push that back. And now coming to the portals here, the light's bouncing around, not receiving light on this side, but it's receiving less because these three portals are recessed into the building. So from about this point down, it's receiving less and less light. So we arc that down and show that cavernous volume there, because that's about a 3 or 4 story portal you're walking into to enter the building. And then to project these sound waves out here at the top, there are panels to project the bells when they're rung during the day. And those are encased in Gothic detailing, those openings. And that stone language is brought down. And these lower buttressing effects cast shadows onto the tower. So receive light from the south and then project a shadow onto the side of it. And now to enhance the sort of walkway over to it, we'll detail some of the voids in that stone rail over the fence. And show that asphalt base walking up to it. So to give some character and scale to this being, because it looks just sort of like a block now, there are terraces along the way for apartments to walk out onto. So if you just project those lines down and show a little bit of detail at that corner of some of the windows opening, so we understand it's a housing block. And Paris is unusual because it's the densest city in the world, not in terms of population per square foot, but in terms of architecture per square foot. Because if you imagine a large disk, and that disk is 7 stories tall, and it's all architecture except for some really well-placed parks, it remains the densest amount of humanity in terms of square footage. There are cities with more population per square foot, but it remains so dense. And they've kept that intact by this being a law in the city. You can't build taller than this, unless you're outside the city district, in hopes of maintaining the quality of the medieval aspects and the classical periods of having their dominant buildings being the skyline and not overwhelmed with 20th century towers and the like. So we'll end this sketch with the issue of the fire recently, the calamity that generated billions of dollars in gifts right away to rebuild Notre Dame as soon as possible. It's going to take decades because as it destroyed the exterior structure, it destroyed the interior and the artwork in there. So whatever they could salvage and redo or rebuild, they're working on that, and that'll take a long time. It will probably be part of the Olympics, at least in an exterior effect and some of the scaffolding down, and seem like it's well on its way, but this is a massive undertaking because it was thoroughly engaged by this fire for many hours on end. But there's hope that it'll be brought back in time and we'll be able to see the vestige of it in all of its glory again. The roof, the interiors, the spire, even they thought at one time they lost the crown of thorns, which used to be housed in Notre Dame. But apparently, as the story goes, that was a relic, that was a copy of it there because they couldn't have the public looking at the original one because it's got such a precious value to it that that relic is safe. And so with this, and its completion fairly quickly, began the promise for the next one along the way. If this is the scale of Notre Dame. So this rose to 104 feet, and I believe Chartres Cathedral started its compromise of building from its original Romanesque western front to even taller nave to about 120 feet, and then higher and higher at Rheims, Amiens, and Beauvais. They kept marching up. Then eventually the Gothic, which is referred to as the High Gothic period, probably reached a physical problem of you can't take stone higher than that, and Beauvais, the last of the great French cathedrals, collapsed not just once but twice on the building of the crossing tower here. So when you visit Beauvais, you can see this much of the church, which is still a spectacle. but it shows that there is a limit to what the Middle Ages could do without the appropriate mathematics and contemporary skills we have today. So that ends our tour of Notre Dame via the pencil point, and hopefully you've enjoyed the idea of processing architectural historical language through the actual drawing of aspects. And hopefully we'll see you in future drawings with Viking.TV as we march our way through the history of the Western canon. Thanks for joining me today, Pen Before Mouse. I'm Mark Keane, Keane on Architecture.